You will be refunded for... Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the launch of Duty to Country Education Project. My name is John Melegrito, Executive Secretary of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project, FilVetrep, and I will be your host this evening. First, let's acknowledge our distinguished guests who are with us tonight. We're delighted to have you here with us in this launch. It has been more than 9 years since FilVetrep came together to create a national campaign to raise national awareness about the service and sacrifice of Filipino and American World War II veterans. This campaign led to their national recognition when the U.S. Congress honored them with the Congressional Gold Medal on October 25, 2017. With that mission accomplished, FilVetrep undertook its second mission, which is to develop an online interactive educational program to preserve the historic legacy of Filipino and American World War II veterans. It is my honor and privilege to now introduce Major General Antonio Taguba, U.S. Army retired, who will provide an overview of our education program. General Taguba is the National Chairman of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. He is the son of a Filipino World War II veteran and a staunch advocate of veterans' rights. He has been the driving force of this historic mission since FilVetrep was formed in 2013. Please let's welcome Major General Taguba.
Okay. I hope everybody can see me. Thanks, John, for that kind of introduction. Before I start, I'm proud to wear a sweatshirt that depicts Duty to Country Education Project. And for those of you who have not seen it before, let me step in front of the podium and kind of take a close look at it. It is a collage of people who have fought the war, who supported this project over time. And I hope you will buy them from our storefront. All right, public service announcement. Again, thanks very much, and good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us from across the country and the Philippines on this exciting announcement of a long-awaited program that must never be shelved or forgotten. On November 6, 2020, FilVetrep and its education team launched Duty to Country Part 1, which represented a virtual exhibition or historical experience in oral history replete with graphics and illustrative artifacts of the Filipino veterans' experience. The program depicted the colonial period that began in 1898 between the United States and the Philippines, the U.S. imperialism period, World War II, post-war, and the contemporary period in the 70s up to today. Tonight's presentation is part 2 of the education project, and this is the interactive web-based program that provides curriculum and lesson plans designed for public access, available to schools, teachers, students, cultural and historical organizations, and the public at large, on the untold stories of the Filipino veterans of World War II. Their seminal story during World War up to now is central to the program, how they fought at Bataan and Corregidor under General Douglas MacArthur, the tragedy of the Bataan Death March, the destruction of Manila, the liberations of the Philippines, and victory over the Japanese in September 1945. The post-war tragedy extended beyond the war with the passage of the Rescission Act of 1946 by Congress. Up until the beginning of World War II in the Philippines, their historical account was largely written by American historians or leaders of Army units commanded by mostly American officers, who conveniently left out the contributions of Filipino men and women on how they served under the United States flag. Volumes upon volumes of America's success on the battlefield were archived in libraries, in museums, and historical foundations that collected dust over time. Personally, I pondered exactly on how did the United States win a victorious war against the Japanese in the Philippines without the full measure and contributions of lives of Filipinos fighting and dying on behalf of a country that colonized them. Had it not been the tireless determination of veterans who petitioned and pleaded with the United States government to provide them with their promised benefits, did we uncover the generation of soldiers and guerrillas, men and women, who fought under the American flag, were we able to raise awareness and public attention of a devastating betrayal upon thousands of loyal Filipinos who fought and defended the United States and the Philippines. This startling revelation created a national call to action to fight for their national recognition. But we wanted more for them by creating a platform, a virtual interactive program to tell their history, their oral narrative of their suffering and hopes. The Congressional Gold Medal was a great start, a resounding accomplishment passed by Congress in 2016 that declared them as veterans. The Duty to Country is a platform we created as the educational venue to enshrine their story for generations. To educate the public is powerful. To tell America of their heroic acts, about the Rescission Act of 1946 passed by Congress that denied them of promised benefits and revoked their path to American citizenship. The Rescission Act is still active today, along torment likened to a ball and chain around their necks for almost 80 years. Honor and dignity taken away from them, their identity and reputation besmirched. The reward of victory in the Philippines was met with a long, arduous march of agony and despair for over 70 years. Now we want to correct this history as a way to be their voices for generation, to make it right for them, to make it known that they existed, they died or wounded for America. They will not be forgotten. It became a clarion call for redemption, for reckoning, for ultimate recognition. Duty to Country Education Project is a huge mission of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project. We are a national group comprised of volunteers supported by affiliated nonprofit organizations, academic and legal advisors, teachers and educators, sponsors and donors, and assisted by historical and cultural organizations such as the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of American History, the National Museum of the United States Army, and members of Congress. We also maintain an association of advocates in the Philippines, especially with the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office in Manila. Since the inception of gaining the Congressional Gold Medal and production of Duty to Country Education Project, we relied exclusively on corporate and individual sponsors and private donations to invest. This is an investment on this ongoing project. You have not received any federal or state funding from anywhere else. We are excited to share this incredible program with all of you tonight. I hope you will appreciate what Duty to Country is about, its educational and cultural value, the stories it reveals, the illustrations, animations, and artifacts displayed, the meaning and countless questions you would want to ask, to share and to teach, and why this project is a significant part of American history. I hope you will be motivated and inspired by Duty to Country. Our presenters with Matthew Fisher, principal of Night Kitchen Interactive, who developed the Duty to Country program, with Dr. Colin Woods, PhD, Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland at College Park. We found Dr. Woods at the University of Maryland teaching this piece of history, so we asked her for her help. Dr. Chris Capozzola, Professor of History at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had been involved with this topic for over 20 years. So over dinner of sushi many years ago, one evening, he relented and joined us. I may also add that Dr. Woods and Dr. Capozzola are renowned historians and authors in their own right who have researched the history of the Philippines and the United States colonial relationship up until the current era. Our principal objective is for all of you to access, share, utilize Duty to Country and the lesson plans with teachers, students, families, and the public at large. There is no cost to you other than time to study and to learn. At the end of our presentation, we welcome your questions and interest. We also request your feedback on the product so we can add to it and improve the program over time. There will be more iterations of Duty to Country as we are committed to do this program for many more years. So with that, let me turn it back to John. Thank you.
Thank you, General Taguba. And now it's my pleasure. By the way, I like your hoodie, General. I got one too myself. Now it's my pleasure to introduce.
Let's take a look here. Here we are, the bosom twins here.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Fisser, founder and principal of Night Kitchen Interactive, who will now walk us through the design and content of Duty to Country. You know, Night Kitchen Interactive is an award-winning design firm with 20-plus years of experience partnering with museums, science centers, and arts and cultural heritage organizations. We have been privileged to partner with this design company, spending countless hours over the last few weeks to make sure we accomplish our goal with flying colors. Matthew?
Thank you all for joining us. I'm thrilled to share with you the newest release of the Duty to Country online education project. This year, we will be launching a robust section for educators, supplying teachers and students a host of great educational content. First, I will walk you through the Duty to Country website and the Under One Flag exhibition released in 2021. We are proud to report that the project has received several awards, including 2 from the most prominent organizations in the museum industry, the American Alliance of Museums and MWeb. Then I'll take you through the new content, including the For Educators section and a new resources page. We'll also give you a sneak peek of the upcoming graphic novel that we are hoping to publish in 2023. We begin with the introductory video displayed on the homepage.
Duty to Country tells the history of Filipinos' sacrifice and patriotism during World War II and their decades-long quest for recognition and justice after the war.
I think that oftentimes you get written out of history when you're not the one doing the writing.
World War II happened in many other places, and my grandma was one of those people who experienced that, and why have I never heard anything about the Philippines during the war?
No one talks about the Filipinos who were there, much less the fact that we took away their service afterwards. It's sort of a second-class kind of narrative about World War II.
If they rob you of your honor and betray you on the promise that was made to you, they don't pay you and then they discount you. That's hard. You know, it's tantamount to being non-existent.
The Duty to Country Education Project is dedicated to sharing the untold story of 2 nations, the United States and the Philippines, fighting under one flag. This ongoing project includes hours of oral history testimonies, a dynamic online exhibition, and profiles of key historical figures. Under One Flag begins with the colonial period, setting the stage and providing critical context. It recounts the stories of World War II in depth, from generals and privates to guerrillas and civilians, along with telling the larger story of the war in the Philippines through words, photographs, and documentary footage. It brings to life oral history testimonies through dynamic motion comics. The post-World War II era reveals the U.S. government rescinding its commitment to those who fought in the Philippines under our flag. The story continues through the contemporary period. For decades, Filipino Americans, veterans, and others have fought tirelessly all the way to the Supreme Court and into the halls of Congress for recognition, veterans' benefits, and rights of citizenship that had been denied to them. The Duty to Country Education Project features several hours of oral histories, first-hand accounts of living veterans, historians, and community advocates.
Why were Filipinos singled out? Among the 66 nations that were part of the Allied forces, Filipinos were singled out to be deprived of their rightful benefits. Why?
I thought it would be easy to get their benefit, but I found out as a USAPI veteran, you are a second-rate citizen.
Duty to Country aims to recognize these men and women for their service and to prompt all Americans to recognize these events as part of our shared history. And it seeks to empower a new generation of young people to reflect on what we owe our country and how we can ensure America fulfills its promises in the future.
I think most people, by and large, assume that we live in a country where a government does right by our people. Yet, when we uncover the story, it's a story that we need to remember so that we can remain vigilant.
That story is not going to be told unless we do this education project. And we committed ourselves to making sure that that story also becomes enshrined in American history, much like the Navajo Code Talkers, much like the Japanese American Nisei soldiers, much like the African Americans who fought during the Civil War, because this story is part of American history.
Below the introductory video, we now scroll through the homepage, where we showcase the Duty to Country project with a brief description, the online exhibition, Under One Flag, which I'll be exploring in a moment, and the oral histories, where we'll go now to showcase some of the updates we've made, starting with the Explore Topics page, featuring over a dozen different topics that aggregate over 100 different highlight clips from across many hours of oral history testimony. These short compilations of excerpts allow visitors unfamiliar with these stories to explore topics of interest and learn more about them. Each of these topical pages, such as the Struggle for Benefits, showcases a series of clips, displays links to the interviews they are excerpted from, and related topics to explore. These topical pages provide a number of different entrees into the oral history interviews. We'll go back for a moment to the Explore Interviews page, showcasing over a dozen different testimonies. For each of these individual sessions, we have added 5 highlight clips, again to provide visitors with multiple ways to engage in these dynamic stories. I encourage you to explore the individual interview pages, featuring a really wonderful wealth of content. Now I take you to the most comprehensive and dynamic aspect of the project, the online exhibition Under One Flag, America's Broken Promise to the Philippines. We begin with the landing page, which hints at the complex interconnected history of these two nations. We now enter the exhibition, opening up our main menu. Here, visitors can access the introduction, 4 chapters that span the history from the late 19th century to the present day, and a conclusion. We'll begin with the introduction. When you select a chapter, you can scroll down and explore in more depth the sections for that chapter. This chapter features the untold story, which provides an overview of the project. Each section begins with an animated illustration. Our dynamic, thoughtful script, written by historian Chris Capizzola, is paired with hundreds of archival images and relevant highlights from our oral history testimonies, such as this.
Why should Americans care about this piece of history? Because I think it complicates what is otherwise a sort of romanticized notion about World War II, right? I think most Americans don't realize that World War II in the Pacific was not simply about Japanese aggression, that it was about which empire, the United States or Japan, was going to have imperial control, that it wasn't about Japanese aggression, and it wasn't simply won by the US commitment to democracy, right? There is a story about geopolitics and power here that I think looking at this Philippine story helps us sort of come to terms with, right? We really can't understand the history of World War II in the ways that I think popular narratives have framed it so far.
We also have included a range of maps, dozens of clips from the numerous documentaries produced on this topic over the years by filmmakers such as Sonny Azone, and bold text callouts. There are documents of note, such as the Rescission Act of 1946, and photographs through to the contemporary day.
This is not just a Filipino thing. This is actually an American story. This is not just a Filipino story of a bunch of, brown men, taking up guns, to fight the Japanese. But that's the narrative that we've been told. So that's why it was easy to dismiss them. But this is actually an American story. And it's important for the American people, and this is why they saw the dignity and honor that comes with participating and supporting these efforts, that they have as much at stake as Filipinos do in ensuring that these Filipino veterans, their story is enshrined in American history.
The introduction goes on to present the 4 chapters: the colonial period, World War II, post-war, and all the way through to the contemporary period. One of my favorite aspects of the exhibition is that the menu acts as a high-level timeline. You can scroll through the sections of each chapter to get a bird's-eye view of the story. We begin the colonial period with building a nation in the late 19th century. Then into the turn of the century with the Philippine-American War. Next, we focus on America's colonial presence through the 1930s. Chapter 2, The Crucible of War, covers from 1934 to 1945. It begins with the road to war, which takes us up to attack and invasion, those fateful hours of December 7th and 8th, 1941, on to the battles of Bataan and Corregidor, and the infamous Death March. We then explore Japanese occupation from 1941 to 1945, and then revisit that time period, exploring the experiences of the guerrillas. I'm going to take a moment to jump into this section as you could with any section, to learn more. As I mentioned before, we begin each section with a call-out quote and a dynamic presentation of our illustration. We showcase our script alongside historic photographs, profile cards, oral history testimonies, and one of the most dynamic aspects of the exhibition, animations that bring our oral histories to life.
Ang takot ng mga panahon yun hindi ko nararamdaman.
Messenger for the guerrillas. When I signed on to join the guerrillas, they made me a runner, a messenger. During that time, I was fearless. The Japanese posted sentries around the town perimeter, but I was free to come and go as I pleased. To them, I was just an 11-year-old boy. My job was to get information, to relay letters back and forth between the guerrillas. My horse was my cover. Outfitted with coconuts and more, Yameru! We looked like we were fresh from the fields. But under the saddle, the real harvest was hidden, and I made sure it got into the right hands.
Sa bayan, ito dali mo doon sa etong balita.
We move on again, providing more archival photographs drawn from our deep research, working together with our historians. Showcase our profile cards, and then bring to life other oral history testimonies.
One of the most interesting things that there's a number of women who participate in this resistance movement.
Women of the resistance. It's estimated that 1 out of 10 Philippine guerrillas was a woman. Remarkably, many of these brave women were not only nurses and spies, but commanders of troops and entire regiments. Remedios Gomez Paraiso, a.k.a. Commander Liwayway, wore her red lipstick into battle as she commanded a squadron in the Hukbalahap. Refusing to retreat, she was twice captured and released by the Japanese. Valeria Yai Panlilio concealed military intelligence in her radio broadcasts and helped coordinate the resistance in Manila. After attracting the attention of Japanese intelligence, Panlilio fled to the mountains. There, with her future husband, Major Marcos Agustin, she led an army of guerrillas. Josefa Capistrano founded the Women's Auxiliary Service, a group of more than 3,000 strong who nursed the wounded and spied on the enemy. Magdalena Leones was the first Filipina to receive the U.S. Silver Star for smuggling radio parts and intelligence through enemy territory. Tragically, the U.S. refused to recognize most of these brave women warriors. Only registered nurses were put on their roster, and the vast majority of female guerrillas were unable to claim benefits despite promises made.
It's not a simple question of they were fighting for one country or the other. Both those countries were wrapped up together, and they've remained that way in the decades since.
I'll scroll through this section a bit more to show you just a few of the amazing photographs that we have collected for this project. So we move on now to October 1944, Liberation. And then on to the last chapter of World War II, Devastation and Victory, taking us through to September of 1945. Next, our shortest yet most critical chapter, Chapter 3, Promises Made, Promises Broken. This walks us through Philippine Independence Day in 1946 and highlights the promises made to Filipinos of rights and benefits for their service, just like any other GI fighting under the American flag. And then the fateful document of 1946, the Rescission Act, revoking those benefits. Chapter 4, The Long Road to Equity, covers the period from 1946 to the present. Decades of the ongoing struggle in the American courts, the influx of a new Filipino-American community in the 1970s and 80s, and legislative efforts in the 1990s. Few gains led to frustrations, with the greatest generation taking to the streets in the late 90s and early 2000s. We underscore bittersweet victory of the Equity Fund of 2009, and then the Congressional Gold Medal of 2017. And finally, we come to the conclusion. The fight continues. Before I explore this section, I'd like to take a moment to show you some of the other features of the site, including the menu that allows you to jump to any section, and media pages that gather together the animations throughout the exhibition, some of which I'll show you now.
The story that my dad told me and I grew up with was that he was in the march going on his way to, I think it was Capas Tarlac. And then him and two other people were like, we're gonna escape.
Escape from Bataan. My grandfather, a Yusufe medic, was one of the 80,000 Filipino and American servicemen captured in Bataan. Most were sick and hungry. Many were wounded. The Japanese forced them to march more than 60 miles in the extreme heat. After days of endless walking, there came an opportunity to escape, a nearly impenetrable sugarcane grove along the road. While the guards were distracted, he and two of his comrades made a break for it. Bullets flying after them, they plowed through the razor-sharp sugarcane. It cut their skin to ribbons, but they made it through. Others tried to follow, but the guards shot them down. A mad scramble brought them up on the edge of a river. To reach safety, they had to cross it, but one of them could not swim. Under threat of capture, they stopped and built a raft to carry him across. Half drowned, the three men escaped into the mountains. Many others weren't so lucky. Almost 20,000 men would perish on that long march to the prison camp.
And there were some other people after they tried to run away who tried to follow. They tried to escape too, but of course they didn't make it.
Nung ako'y guerrilla, ang ibig sabihin ko yun, nung ako'y kumasa ako ng mga guerrilla, informer.
Under the hood, the Makapili were collaborators. They identified members of the resistance to the enemy. To protect his own identity, the Makapili put a straw bag over his head. The Japanese would line up the villagers, and the Makapili would point out the guerrillas. As one of the youngest guerrillas, it was my job to spy on the Makapili. I could go after him unseen and unheard as he slipped into the jungle. He could not know that he was being followed. My life depended on it. When he thought he was safe, that no one was around, he removed the bag, and I saw his face.
Bago ikukunin ngayon namin sa tatransfer namin sa mga guerrilla. Yeah. Yan ang nangyayari.
Even back then, there was a lot of fake news going around. So my dad's job was to report to the Filipino people.
During the occupation, the Japanese waged a propaganda war in the Philippines. My father produced The Liberator, an underground newspaper that exposed their lies. The Liberator reported troop movements and Allied victories. It boosted morale and encouraged Filipinos to join the resistance. Hidden in the jungle, the writers had limited equipment and made ink from bark and berries. They ran the generator at night and relocated every few days to stay ahead of the enemy. Once copies were printed, they had to get them into the hands of their readers. My uncle smuggled The Liberator, posing as a bread delivery boy. Anyone caught with an anti-Japanese publication faced torture or even death. Once, when he was making his rounds, his contact saw him approaching and began to shout, "No bread today!" My uncle walked past, not daring to breathe until he made it out of the village. Sometimes, as many as 500 people shared a single copy. The Liberator was one of the few papers to survive until the end of the war.
His newspaper was so well produced, the Japanese never thought that they were publishing anything other than Manila.
Tapos nagkatisiya, titingnan natin kung saan naputok. At kung saan naputok, at yun siya. Yun ang ating titirahin.
Forged under fire. During the U.S. evacuation, our forces were pinned down at a church in Manaoag. A Japanese machine gunner hiding in the woods opened fire on us. I placed a sweet potato onto the barrel in front of me and watched the clearing. The machine gun rattled, revealing its position. I looked to my sergeant for orders, but he had vanished. So I picked up the smoking pieces of my lunch and said, "Listen up! We have to take out that gun if we are going to survive." I ordered the men to run in groups of 2 and lay suppressing fire as we advanced. We ran fast in a zigzag pattern, dodging bullets and staying low. I fired my carbine at the Japanese as I sprinted for cover. Bullets ripped through our lines as we inched closer to their position. Finally, we got within range. Through our weight of fire, we silenced the guns. The field went quiet. We all stood up, and the men looked to me. I was 16 years old. I asked, "Where is the sergeant? My coward sergeant." We found him drinking coffee back at the camp.
Hindi, pagkakita. Doon na ako ng Punteria sa nagkikistori. Hindi pa kami napapatigil. Pagtigil, tilitin na namin. Kung puputok pa, ay hindi na. At tingin na malamang na patay na yung
I thought it will be easy to get their benefit, but I found out as a USAPI veteran, you are a second-rate citizen.
Benefits denied. Promised that we would have the same benefits granted to any GI. But in 1946, Congress passed the Rescission Act. It blocked us from claiming citizenship, health care, and education. When I tried to immigrate to the United States, my application was repeatedly denied. In 1990, over 40 years later, an immigration bill gave me a new opportunity to apply for citizenship. I applied, and twice more, I was denied. On my third try, I was able to join my son in America. I became an activist and urged the government to fulfill the promises made to my fellow veterans. 20 years after I arrived, the Equity Bill made some of us eligible for a payment. Yet again, I was denied. My lawyer was able to prove I had been left off the US-recognized guerrilla roster. Finally, after several years of resubmitting documents, I was approved for a payment in October of 2017. It was a start. Almost a century has passed since World War II. This year, I turn 103 years old, and the Rescission Act is still in place.
Old soldiers never die. They just fade away.
I worked with the staff in coming up with an immigration bill.
Equity at last. As a member of Senator Inouye's staff, I worked on immigration cases for Philippine veterans. I brought the rising number of cases to his attention, and we began to craft legislation to address the injustices done to these veterans. Our first victory came in the early 90s. We ushered through a bill allowing veterans to be naturalized as citizens. But progress was slow. Every Congress for 18 years voted down our bills for veterans' benefits. In 2009, we were close to passing a provision to provide benefits payments to veterans. But Republican senators, including John McCain, argued against it. I called Senator Inouye to ask if he needed any help. "No, I've got this," he told me. I love America, and I am proud of this country. But this is a black chapter. These men served us well. They died for us. They got wounded for us, and they deserve recognition. The bill passed. 4 years later, as vice chair of PhilVet Rep, I helped pass another bill to award Filipino veterans official recognition. In 2016, with over 380 co-sponsors, we passed the Congressional Gold Medal Act.
Not many people know what the contributions that the Filipino veterans provided, but a lot of people need to know.
There are several other animations I encourage you to watch. Our project also features 30 dynamic profile cards designed by our fantastic illustrator, Aria Villafranca, capturing many of the dynamic personalities in the story. Of course, there are many that we couldn't create cards for, but we selected several of the key figures who play a role in the history of the Filipino veterans and explore their stories in more detail. These biographies, written by our historian, Colleen Woods, focus on how these people, some of whom are household names and many lesser known, played a role in this story. Of course, we also have cards that reflect our own living heroes. John Melagrito, PhilVet Rep Secretary, Marie Blanco, Vice Chair of PhilVet Rep, and of course we can't forget our fearless leader, General Taguba, Chairman of PhilVet Rep. Finally, I'd like to show you the illustrations page. This gathers together all of the illustrations that act as section headers throughout our exhibition. and allows visitors to explore them in more detail here and really enjoy the range and depth of how our illustrator brought the stories to life visually. We return now to our concluding chapter, The Fight Continues, in which our historian Chris Capizzola captures the key takeaways from this project. We showcase some of our closing oral history highlights and explore some thoughts for the future. Under One Flag was created to share this story with general audiences. Our latest update ensures that the story will continue to be shared for generations to come by bringing the Duty to Country Education Project into the classroom. Our curriculum designer, Leah Namias, cooperated with our scholars, Chris Capizzola and Colleen Woods, and a team of classroom educators. Together, they developed a suite of compelling lesson plans and activities aligned to curriculum standards. These lesson plans and explainer activities integrate primary and secondary sources from the Duty to Country project and beyond, and are available at no cost to schools or educators in the For Educators section of the Duty to Country website at dutytocountry.org. They can be accessed as interactive web pages or as downloadable, printable PDFs. The For Educators section includes 5 lesson plans covering topics from U.S. imperialism in World War II to civil rights and social justice. Each lesson plan provides a brief summary, teacher background, instructions for students, primary sources, and related explainer activities. For example, in putting the Rescission Act on trial, students review up to 14 primary source documents to prepare for and conduct a mock trial of the 1946 Rescission Act. Each lesson plan was devised with teachers in mind and revised based on their feedback after using them in the classroom. Our 10 explainers provide further flexibility for educators by offering single-period activities that engage students directly with primary documents, archival photographs, and oral histories. These focus on a number of topics, such as the Philippine Revolution, the Bataan Death March, and Philippine immigration to the United States. For researchers and students in higher education, our advisor, Colleen Woods, created a resources page. This page lists dozens of trusted resources for students and scholars to explore the topics beyond the Duty to Country Education Project, and can be accessed from the For Educators section of dutytocountry.org. We are pleased to report that the educational curriculum that we have developed this past year has already begun to take root amongst teachers and classrooms across the country. Before we go, I'd like to give you a sneak peek at one of the most exciting upcoming additions to the Duty to Country project, a graphic novel. Collaborating with Under One Flag exhibition artist Aria Villafranca, the graphic novel In the Shadow of Giants is expected to be released in 2023. This work of historical fiction was inspired by the real-life events of World War II veterans recorded through the Duty to Country Oral History Project. It tells the story of a young Filipino American who uncovers the mystery of her grandmother's secret life as a guerrilla leader during World War II. We are currently in the process of identifying a publisher to work with us to reach the widest possible audience. If you know of an agent or a publisher who might be interested, please let us know and we'll add them to our list. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of the Duty to Country Education Project, the latest updates, and a taste of what's to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, for walking us through the design and content of Duty to Country. You know, seeing those images again, you know, those fascinating animations of war, it makes me think of my dad again and his 270,000 comrades whose stories we have enshrined for posterity. Now, an overview of this project will now be presented by members of our academic team, Dr. Colleen Woods and Professor Chris Capizzola. Dr. Colin Woods is an associate professor in the University of Maryland's Department of History, and Professor Chris Capuzzola is a professor of history at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he teaches classes on political and legal history, war and the military, and the history of immigration.
Now, Lita. So our first priority when Build That Rep began, believe it or not, almost 9 years ago, was to gain recognition for the service and sacrifice of World War II veterans with the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal. But we never thought of recognition as a one-time event. Instead, from the beginning, the Build That Rep team set our vision on creating an educational platform that would ensure that the stories of Filipino vets would continue to be told, as Matthew Fisher said, for generations to come. With our educational program, we wanted to make it easier for teachers to bring primary sources, oral histories, and the Under One Flag digital exhibit into the classroom and to engage students in the story of Filipino and American veterans. While the educational materials available on Duty to Country will certainly enrich teachers and students' understanding of World War II, this story goes far beyond the war years. As you will see in our lesson plans and explainers, it is a story that intersects with major themes in US history, including immigration, civil rights, and social movements, politics, and US foreign policy. From the beginning, we knew we wanted a wide range of teachers and students to be able to engage with this history in a multifaceted way through animated videos, oral histories, photographs, and documents. This diversity of sources will help, we think, teachers engage students at various grade levels. To help students and teachers, to help educators and students engage directly with the sources we've compiled, we have created a series of lesson plans and activities that will provide historical context and prompts for reflection. Our educational materials do cover 100 years of history, but we've designed our site so that teachers don't have to teach 100 years of history at a time. Instead, they can choose different entry points, allowing them to adopt lesson plans to fit different parts of the curriculum. For example, our lesson plan titled, You Decide, Filipino Veterans' Long Fight for Justice could easily be taught alongside other social movements of the long civil rights era. The educational program we put together will not only help ensure that the stories of Filipino veterans and their fight for justice are not forgotten, we also believe it will aid teachers in approaching some of the most important topics in 20th century US history in new and exciting ways.
Thank you, Colleen, for those thoughtful comments, and thank you, everyone, for being in the audience here this evening. I'm glad to join you to share with you the latest developments in the For Educators section of Duty to Country. You've had an account of PhilVet-Rep's work and some of the efforts that we've done to share this history with educators. I want to take a minute to just give you a sense of the rich content in the materials themselves. We're joined also by Leah Namias, who will be here for the Q&A when you can ask specific questions about what's in the lesson plans, what's in various curriculum materials. And she can also reflect on her work with some of the teachers, some of whom are on this call this evening, who workshopped this material with us, who tested it in their classrooms, and really ensured that we have the best history and the most sort of fitting tribute in the classroom to the Filipino veterans and their advocates. I also want to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about how people in the audience can advocate and be allies for this curriculum material by spreading the news about it in our own networks and in our own school districts all around the country and beyond. So first, I think that I want to start by talking about the highlights of the lesson plans themselves. They equip K-12 educators with materials that they need to tackle some of the biggest questions in US history, world history, and American civics and politics. Big questions like war, empire, and migration, colonization, the military service of our veterans, questions of racial discrimination, civil rights, and the fight for racial justice. And yet, even as they tackle these big questions, they do so in a very personal way, as you saw from these videos, from the oral histories, from the testimony of descendants. These are sort of graphic narratives. They are media objects that sort of meet our students where they are online, right? Meet them in many sort of multimedia formats, giving history a human face. And they approach the topic in very different ways, with different kinds of sources, different kinds of classroom experiences. This is designed so that students at all different kinds of grade levels, students with very different language backgrounds and reading abilities, students with different learning styles, some who prefer text, some who like to draw, like our illustrator, Aria Villafranca, right? That everyone can find a path into this history in a really productive way. Second, I'm particularly excited by the fact that all of these lesson plans fold students into this history, into the history they encounter. They're not just watching this history. They're not just being told about it by their teachers. They're finding their own way through it. And Leah Namias can talk about some of the specific ways that students might own this history, right? And that they also might be sort of accountable for it. Right. So whether they're thinking about, what are the motivations of the people who passed the Rescission Act, if they're thinking about what are the tools of oral history, right? How did we record these histories? Why do we do something like that? Time and again, we ask students during the lesson to think and reflect on, well, what does this mean to you today? What does this history from 70 years ago sort of empower you to do today, and also obligate you to do today? Right? That for 70 years, Filipino World War II veterans and their advocates have been calling and seeking to hold the United States government and citizens accountable for what happened during and after World War II. And in many ways, these lesson plans continue that project of holding us accountable as teachers and as learners for the history that we learn and the history that we carry forward. Okay? And we also shared this history with teachers all around the country, some of whom are watching this evening. And you saw some brief quotes from them in Matthew Fisher's presentation. I'll just share one or two of the additional quotes that they actually shared directly with us. One said, "This is a great resource for teaching Asian American studies, especially with the need for culturally responsive curriculum and equity in schools." And I think that's really important. Another reflected that the lesson on the movement for Filipino veterans benefits complements the lessons I already teach on the civil rights movements and helps students see how they have agency to make change too. Right? Exactly that kind of sort of connecting and empowering goal of the project. One said, "Duty to country makes this topic come alive. It is a topic that is often overlooked or not addressed or appears in social studies textbooks that are written primarily from white Americans' perspective. It is engaging and relevant." And I think that's been really important and a goal for us as we've done this. So third, let me just talk about how you might advocate for duty to country if you are watching this evening and you are not an educator yourself. Right? How can I support this project? How can I make sure that it's taught in my district? The first is just to share the news about it in every network that you have, your personal connections, friends and family you have who may be educators, through social media, of course. Right? And if you have the time, if you have the, a little bit of courage, right, reach out directly to the school board in your district. Share the materials with them. They need to know about them. They are looking for materials like this. And if you provide them to them and have a connection, that will be really important. And if you speak about how you believe that these are historically sound, that they will work in the classroom, and that they are culturally informed and appropriate resources, that's really valuable information for school boards, educators, and individual teachers to know, right? They want to be able to trust this resource, And one of the best ways they can do that is to hear it directly from someone in their community. So you might do that and might also point out to them key moments in the year, in the calendar: Asian American and Pacific Islander History Month, Filipino American History Month, Veterans Day, Pearl Harbor Day, moments where they might actually kind of bring this material to their students in very meaningful ways. Now, if you hear from a teacher who says, well, this sounds really interesting, but I don't feel like I ever learned this history, right? How can I teach it myself, right? We have lesson plan number 1 is how to teach with duty to country, right? Sort of starting from square one. Let's say you meet an administrator who says, well, this sounds great, but the curriculum's already full, right? We don't have room to add something else, right? Then what you can do is take them to some of the lesson plans on the website where we actually key the lessons to critical learning skills that are already in the curriculum and say, look, if you're already teaching about war or citizenship or civil rights, or even how a bill becomes a law, right? If you're teaching that, you're already teaching duty to country, right? And we can equip you to do it in more interesting, more diverse, and more accountable ways, right? And most importantly, if you meet a group of students, particularly Filipino or Filipino American students, who ask you, why is our history not represented in schools, right? Why is it not being told in our voices? Why is it not being told as our history on our terms? Then send them to Duty to Country and have them talk to their teachers and their principals and their school boards, right? They will be our sort of greatest advocates. So we wrote these lesson plans, obviously, for many people, but 3 groups in particular. First, for the veterans themselves and their advocates who risked so much and fought for so long, right? And I want to say that, I think on behalf of all of us, we really do feel blessed and trusted, blessed to be trusted as caretakers of the veterans' stories. We wrote the lesson plans for many of you on this call who have advocated for them over the years, cared for them in their old age, and preserved their histories for future generations. And finally, we wrote our lesson plans for students, students of all ages, those who already know and cherish and carry this history, and those who are just beginning to learn of the rich inheritance that the veterans bequeathed to us, not only on the battlefield, but in the courtrooms, legislative halls, and streets of our country. Thank you, and back to John.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Capasola, Dr. Woods, and I also want to recognize Leah Namias, who was our curriculum director, developer, and designer. So now that you have seen and heard an overview of the content of Duty to Country, I know that you probably have questions that you want to ask. So if you have some questions, you may either post them on live chat and we'll relay them to our team, or if you're in the studio audience, you can also post them here. So let's take our first question. Mr. Sunny Buza.
Well, thank you for that question, Sunny. I appreciate this. This is and I think this is something that as a group we've grappled with, and I may ask Leah Namias to sort of follow up on this with her reflections. And I think we started from a point of making sure that these plans would work for every district in America, and that they would work for every student, right, who comes from sort of different political backgrounds, different views on the world. And I think that the best way to do that is with sort of really good, accurate history. And that's where we started. And I think that's what the response would be. I think that it's also the case that we have tried to design a curriculum that crosses the political spectrum, right? That is honest about our history and moments where there has been racial discrimination, but that also documents ways in which individuals sort of responded to racial discrimination and transformed it, right? And just for those who may be listening who didn't hear the initial question, was how coming from a question from a listener in Virginia, right? In where sort of the politics of education and curriculum are in our current sort of partisan environment can be conflicted and contested. So I've tried to respond to that, and maybe Leah can say hello to everyone this evening and offer some additional reflections.
Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. I've thought a lot about this question too. I think, practically speaking, I would lead with the fact that this is the story of veterans, right? And that this is a story of Americans who fought in the military and served in World War II, and then their long fight to get recognition and benefits, which is a story that I think lots of people can connect to across the political spectrum. So that would be one thing I would talk about. I would also, say that this is a curriculum that provides space for students to kind of make up their mind about what they think happened, right? That no one is telling the students what to think, but that this creates kind of an active way for students to make sense of a really complex law like the Rescission Act, or to make sense of the US imperialism in the Philippines, right? And so this is a constructivist curriculum that allows students to kind of weigh primary sources and assess them, with guidance from teachers, but this isn't like, a politicized, biased, lecture from the teacher, which I think is when you hear people talking about critical race theory, that's one of the things they're very concerned about. And so being able to talk about how students can make up their own minds about what happened by exploring the historical sources and discovering for themselves, I think is another way to speak back to those concerns.
We have a question from the chat. What are the ages that the curriculum was designed for?
I can speak to that. So I would say that the lessons are primarily designed for middle school and high school, and they can be scaled to be more difficult, more challenging, or less difficult or less challenging, depending on the age and levels of the students. I also know that when we were testing these materials with teachers, some of them said, oh, there are some techniques in here that are really great. I teach high school, but I teach special ed students. So the fact that there's ways for students to respond through art or through creating something, as opposed to just kind of, your classic like test where you're writing everything out, that it would really help students respond to a lot. And I will just emphasize especially how awesome the animations and the illustrations and the videos in the online exhibit themselves are for like bringing in kids of lots of different levels. And I think that teachers can take a look at the material. There's a lot there. So the big thing is just having teachers kind of spend some time with it to kind of realize what's there and pull out the pieces that work for their students.
And I could say that I think, yes, we are geared towards K through 12, but I teach a 400 level college course, which means juniors and seniors essentially. And I decided to use one. I was doing US imperialism in the Philippines, and I decided to use one of our lesson plans, and it worked amazingly with my juniors and seniors and at the university level as well. So I do think they're designed to be sort of adaptable as well. So they could be used in a university classroom, but certainly K through 12.
While we're waiting for some more questions, I'll also add one other point, which is we have both lesson plans, which are designed for teachers to do a full-length lesson. We also have very short features called explainers, which is basically a very quick sort of resource for explaining some aspect of this history. And this is where I always say that these are useful for everyone, because many of us who spent years trying to overturn the legacy of the Rescission Act, run into people who just kind of need it explained to them. And so I would send you there, right? We are all lifelong learners and we are all lifelong teachers. And so there are great resources for people of all ages.
Another question. I would like to sell this curriculum to my school district, but I don't know where to start, nor do I have the tools and materials or sales kit to do this successfully and efficiently.
Chris talked about this a little bit, so I'll jump in here and then maybe Chris can reiterate or Colleen can add her thoughts. So depending on the size of your school district, there are a couple different places to start. If your school district has a social studies or specialist that is in charge of curriculum and instruction, so most school districts will have someone who kind of works on the curriculum and instruction side, and they advise all of the teachers and all of the schools in the district. Reaching out to the person who's in charge of the social studies curriculum and instruction would be my point of entry. If you're in a smaller community, you could always just reach out to a building level principal or a superintendent. All of the materials for the curriculum, we can share some links, I think, about kind of a one-page overview of the curriculum, that's like, and I always say what you want to bring in is your tool that gets the conversation started, right? But the most powerful advocate will be you talking about why this is important. All of the lesson plans and explainer materials can also, they're formatted to be printed out if you need to. So if you're really on your thing, you can print those out, bring them in a nice shiny binder and have that conversation. But I think your point of entry in a school district is going to be your curriculum person who focuses on social studies. I also know that as states are passing new Asian American studies requirements, there's not necessarily a lot of material out there. And what is out there is not necessarily focused on Filipino American history. And so I think folks are really hungry for that. I know students are, I know teachers are, but I also think because of these new requirements to teach Asian American studies, that you are helping people find a really high quality curriculum that has been developed by historians and educators. So I would also, if you live in a state that has recently passed an Asian American Studies curriculum, or already has one if you're in California, then I would recommend that you kind of also talk about that aspect of the curriculum, because I know people are really eager to discover those kinds of resources.
Thank you. Another question. Would Night Kitchen or curriculum consultants be able to create a template or a talking points for laymen, parents, supporters, etc., to present to local school boards and educators?
That's a great idea. I don't know that we have actually thought of that, but Chris, Leah, I think that's a really great idea.
Yeah, that message is coming through loud and clear. This is why we're presenting to you, and recording it for, even this session to be shared with other people down the road, is we want precisely this feedback, right, of what would be useful, right? And so we are hearing that, and we will work on it. So, in the future, under the For Educators tab, there will probably be a point, a sort of document that addresses exactly this issue, right? How can I get this adopted in my school? And so we'll give people the tools that they need. So thanks for this.
Thank you for that question. And let me add to what Dr. Capozzolo has said. Our association and our partnership with Night Kitchen is an ongoing process. We are in a work in progress, you might say, and that's one of the if we'll take that as a recommendation to improve the program. Certainly, we want to help the public in promoting this program and also on accessing it, along with a template, as we say. So we'll take that on as one of our recommendation, and we'll reach out to Night Kitchen and Matthew Fisher. Thank you for your question.
All right, well, thank you very much for, any more questions? One more questions. We'll keep them coming. All right, what is the cost to the district? Well, actually, this program doesn't cost anything, right? I mean, unless you want to donate a lot of money.
You know, we copyrighted this project, and we developed this project. We underwrote the costs and the funding, but we also wanted to be this project to be accessible at no cost, or if there's any limited cost that will parlay over time. Should the school district it approaches us on the cost of the project for them to entail, again, it's no cost to them, other than to promote the program and to have it accessible to students, teachers, schools, and the like. And that's our main objective.
Julie has a question. General Julie.
We have somebody in the studio that wants a hard question. Hang on.
Hi, thank you so much for attending and for participating and speaking at this event. I wanted to ask, for those of us who want to get more involved, what are some of the more known teacher associations that we should be aware of that we potentially could propose this type of curriculum to? Thank you.
That's a good question. So I think the one that jumps to the top of my head is like any of the large national, like social studies, education, and you're catching me at a weak moment where I'm not remembering exactly the acronyms. I would also look at state level teacher associations, because I know that they organize a lot of professional development in their states. Yes, thank you, Chris. National Council for Social Studies. I was like, I had the one for English in my head and I was drawing a blank. I'm sorry. So I think that those are some opportunities. There are at the kind of university level, associations for, people who teach Asian American studies. And I know some of those groups have connections with high school teachers that are teaching Asian American studies, but I am not aware of like high school level associations that are focused on Asian American studies. Colleen or Chris, feel free to jump in if you do know. Unfortunately, no. I would also, depending on where you live, a lot of times your state history museum may also be doing a lot of work to support or statewide historical society, support history education, like training for history educators. And so you might reach out and see what kind of networks they are part of. I think unfortunately, a lot of times things get drilled down at the state level in education. So it's hard to find one size fits all answers.
I would just add one
another question is, has there been outreach outside school systems, such as public libraries?
Not that I know of so far, although I never underestimate John or Tony. So maybe they could answer that question.
See my happy face here. To answer, if I understand the question, we have reached out to several organizations, on the national level, the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the United States Army, and the like. We've also presented to nonprofit organizations like Move Me Hawaii, which we presented to them, and they were willing. Actually, they're on this viewing tonight, where they were prepared to contact the school districts and the office of the school superintendent in Hawaii to present it. So that's a great help. So that would be a start. Another one is we have contact with a congressman, I'm sorry, not a congressman, but school teachers in New Jersey. They're wanting to provide this as part of their Asian American Studies group. We have school districts in Washington State, the Seattle, Tacoma area that's also interested, and that's the reason why we had this public launch, is to showcase it as opposed to going to every district in across the country. We have a school district and school teachers and advocates in San Francisco that are also promoting this program. We have organizations that will help us to showcase the program. Consequently, this is a public relations campaign that we're trying to do. Put it out in the public first. Let it be known that we have a program, an incredible program that was developed by our educators like Leah, Dr. Capozzolo, and Dr. Woods, that is high class. This is an incredible program. And once they see it, perhaps they could share it with their friends, with their teachers, the students, and the like, and tell the world that we have an incredible program on this incredible story. Then we'll go on the roadshow. And once we go on the roadshow, again, funded by our own pockets, since we're a nonprofit group, then we could probably enlarge the aperture, you might say, in promoting duty to country.
Well, thank you all for your questions. I know the questions keep coming. In fact, we have one from Rolando Lavarro, a councilman from New Jersey. He said, New Jersey adopted legislation requiring Asian American Studies as part of the social studies curriculum, and is asking if there are recommendations on pitching the curriculum to Department of Education in order to fulfill the new requirements. That's a very good question, Rolando. I know we'll take note of this. Rosita Lee is asking, how soon would we have this material if school district approves? Well, they're available now, right? Just go to our Duty to Country website. They're available for free. Just buy a hoodie. And Bendy Guzman, the Association of Asian American Studies hasn't always shown full-throated support for film studies. Sometimes the relationship has been complicated. Well, thank you, Ben, for that note. And on that note, thank you, Bing. Again, we thank you for all these questions. They're very thoughtful, insightful, and I know that these questions will help us further fine-tune and enhance and improve the curriculum. So again, I thank our panel, Leah Namias, our curriculum designer and developer, Professor Capozzolo, and Dr. Wood for fielding these questions and for your presentation. So, General, are you now ready to walk us through the next phase of this education program?
Thanks, John. Again, thanks everybody for your questions and for your attention on our launch. I want to do a shout out to Dr. Seth Watkins. He's on Zoom, I believe, or in his lovely home. Dr. Seth Watkins is our legal action person, you might say. He has undertaken pro bono, he's a lawyer, PhD in JD. Has undertaken the action pro bono, as I mentioned, to help our veterans protest, plead, advance their cases before the Department of Veterans Affairs and the courts to get their rightful benefits. He's also part of our academic research committee. Again, the principal objective of Duty to Country Education Project is to reach the classrooms in elementary schools, in high schools, colleges, and universities, which we actually started last year. but we want to go beyond 2022 until we run out of money. That's probably the longest pole in the tent. But this is a story of, we are the platform of the voices of the Filipino veterans and their stories, because most of them are disappearing and most of them are dying 10 to 20 a day here in the Philippines. And I know if our oldest living veteran is going to be 105 years old, and that's Mr. Celestino Almeida, which you saw on the video. And he's going to be 105, as I mentioned. And he is a fierce and determined World War II soldier who was finally recognized on October 25th, 2017, and he was featured on the video. After nearly 30 years of testifying before Congress, the United States Army, Department of Veterans Affairs, and he provided on his own authoritative documents that he did serve under the United States flag. And over time, as I watched him, this is my hero, that how these people on the high level of government questioned his World War II service. His reputation was impugned countless times. His loyalty demeaned, but in the end, he prevailed. And this is exactly why duty to country must prevail as the voice of the Filipino veterans. Now, our next project, beyond this, of course, this is a major project, duty to country. The next project is to call to action to repeal the Rescission Act. And we have started this initiative last year, and we have assembled a team of legal and congressional experts, academic historians, and researchers and volunteers to tackle and compel members of Congress that it's time to do away with the Rescission Act, which is over 75 years old. Now, this will take time, but we are committed to get this done. We have a few thousand living veterans, as I mentioned, who are passing away each day. So we cannot wait any longer. We want the Rescission Act to be repealed and full honors restored for recognition bestowed upon the veterans, past and the present, and their war must end once this thing is passed. We all know that there's no statute of limitation to honor and recognize America's veterans. They have been forgotten for over 80 years, and they are the embodiment of absolute and true citizenship and patriotism, and they are full-fledged members of America's greatest generation. As John had mentioned, we are fully funded entirely with the enormous generosity of corporate and private organizations and sponsors and donors, as well as public donations. And we have yet to receive any funding from the state or federal government. But we will go on until the generosity from the public ends. And we hope it doesn't end. We are an IRS tax-exempt nonprofit organization, and every dollar that we can raise over time since we started this program in 2014 goes to the education program. We are volunteers who are not paid, but we are committed to get this done. So we show you our screen. Feel that rep. With your generosity, we will be able to endure this program. Finally, I want to thank the entire project team, especially Matthew Fisher, the Night Kitchen and Academic Advisory team for producing an incredibly powerful, compelling virtual education program to the living veterans and the families who have told their story, and we don't want their stories to end. To us, all members of the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project, a very special thanks to our generous investors. This is an investment. We think this is an investment, and we know this is an investment with their financial support, their exceptional generosity, and their patience to avail us to present with you Duty to Country Part 2. So spread the word of Duty to Country Education Project. For questions or inquiry, please log on to Duty to Country website at www.dutytocountry.org. That's www.dutytocountry.org, or email. We're also on Facebook, or you can be one of my best friends forever. My email is tonytaguba@ttaguba@aol.com. That's ttaguba@aol.com. Don't be shy. Just Give me an email. I'm sure somebody's going to give you my cell number, and you'll become one of my fans in my base. Just kidding, by the way. Or John Milagrido, if I may say so. His email address is JD, that's Juliet Delta, Milagrido@gmail.com, or my vice chair, Marie Blanco, who could not attend tonight because of illness, mcblanco@verizon.net. So with that, let me turn it back to John with his closing remarks.
Well, thank you, General. We thank our studio audience for keeping us warm tonight. Thank you for coming all the way from wherever you are. I know we also have distinguished guests from the Philippines who are watching and learning about this duty to country launch, and they woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning just to watch this. So we thank you. We thank you.
Storefront.
Storefront, yes. As General Taguba modeled earlier, we have these hoodies. They're in different colors, different sizes. So go to our storefront in the Philippine Philwet Wrap website, the storefront, and they make good holiday gifts. You know, the holidays are never over. There's Valentine's Day, there's Easter, there's my birthday, this is birthday, his birthday, and they make beautiful gifts for your grandchildren. I bought 3 of them for my little grandkids. So they'll be very happy to own proudly, especially with my picture on it, and your picture on it. So thank you very much for supporting us, and stay tuned, stay safe, be warm, and again, thank you very much for supporting Philwet Wrap and honoring our Filipino and American World War II veterans for their dedication, for their service, and for their sacrifice.
Thank you.